Hi, my name's Lauren Brown. I am the founder of Healthy Seminars. I'm also a practitioner, a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. It's called AcuBalance, and we're doing our Throwback Thursday. It is April 2nd, and I'm excited. Today we're going to have the late Al Stone lecture where we're going to talk about pulse, making it ridiculously simple. It's a really popular course. Last week on Throwback Thursday, we had a course by Dr. Leon Hammer, and that was well received. And we put up a poll. So maybe, Sandra, if we have time during today, we may make up a poll. I don't know if you did in advance, but a poll of some of the courses you want to see. And that's how we chose this one. You guys voted for Al Stone, so that one we're excited about. We don't know what we're doing yet for next week. That'll depend on what you want. For the April 16th date, which is a Thursday as well, we're going to put up the late Ray Rubio's Throwback Thursday. It's his keynote from IFS 2017. It's so relevant for us being in isolation these days. It's all about knowing your story, and it was a very spiritual, and I mean, it's that message that he has, which he did in 2017, is even more important today than it was in 2017. So we're going to be doing that one. I do want to let you guys know a few things that we have happening here at Healthy Seminars. We created a resource page just to kind of keep track of everything. And that's healthyseminars.com/resources. You can see our logo is community, unity, immunity. So our talks that we're doing, the free talks on Conscious Tuesday, finding calm in the presence of uncertainty, the Throwback Thursdays, and then all the other stuff that you're going to see here. The whole idea was to create community. So when I talked to my team about this was back in around March 20th, when we started to go into isolation in British Columbia, Canada. I wanted an opportunity for me and my peers to have that community. I knew that we were going to have physical distancing. Now, even though they were calling it social distancing or social isolation, I right away wanted it to be about physical distancing, however, still social connection. And when you have community and it creates unity, we know that is good for your immunity, your immune system. Feeling separate and not having that connection is actually not good for your health, your well-being. And so the purposes of Conscious Tuesday, Throwback Thursday, and all these free resources, and to have your cameras on like you are doing today, is I wanted community. So the way it works for these free recordings is you get to watch it during the live webinar, like you guys who are attending, and we're going to keep the recording up on the page for 48 hours. And after 48 hours, it comes down. So the reason being is for two reasons. One is I want community. I actually want you on the camera with me. And the second thing is I want you to watch the content. I don't want it to sit on your shelf and you watch it 6 years later or 3 months later. And I really want you to watch it with us, hence the 48 hours. It doesn't serve my community dream if you're watching this lecture in isolation by yourself 3 days from now. So if you want the free content that we're offering at Healthy Seminars, you can either attend the live webinar or put it in your calendar if the time zone doesn't work for you and watch it within 48 hours. And here's some of the stuff that we have, and we're going to keep adding to this. So I just want to let you know on the resources page, and you can find this link on the homepage right now as well, halfway down. But we have stuff on telehealth. We have free topical webinars. I'll show you what's happening with that. Conscious Tuesday, Throwback Thursday. And then we do have some paid content as well. The live webinars that we already had scheduled and some of we've added will be coming up through the month of April and forward. So the telehealth live webinars and webinars in general, this free replay is up for another 48 hours. We just did this one. It was excellent. It's about a 90-minute webinar about adding telehealth to your practice. And it's a good introduction to the April 4th, which is not a free one. It's a 5-hour paid one. And it's going to go into in-depth on setting up your telehealth and how to bring value online to your patients. Under the telehealth we got on April 6th, this is another free one. It's on Monday, April 6th. It's with Deborah Betts from New Zealand, Claudia Sikovitz from Australia, Claudia Sikovitz from the United States, Kate Levitt from Australia, and Emily Solomons from here in Vancouver, Canada. And they're going to share with you how to work with pregnant women virtually. because babies aren't going to wait. So what can you do to help prepare them for their birth and during labor, things you can teach their partners. And you're going to take this information and you can then bring this into telehealth. We have one of the tech people from the Jane software that we use at AccuBalance, and that Natasha in her webinar that's on the free replay and the one on April 4th, she uses that as well. So somebody from Jane is going to come in at the last half hour of that talk just to talk about telehealth and their system. But the first hour is all about just value for what you can bring to your patients and share with them. And April 11th, CT Holm has put together a course on TCM facial diagnosis skills for telemedicine, because if you're going to do telemedicine, facial diagnosis is another skill to help you assess your patients. And it's actually, patients really like this. The most busy people right now are shamans and people that do tarot cards and crystal people, astrology, what's happening, what do I need to do? So if you can do facial diagnosis, I think a lot of your patients will love that, that skill that you develop. Free topical webinar. So what we have scheduled now, and as I mentioned, I got a bunch more coming this way. Tomorrow being Friday, April 3rd, Sharon Weisenbaum is doing a 90-minute free webinar on classical Chinese herbal prescriptions in action. It's all about how to treat the presentation. You're not treating the disease. So she's going to do classical Chinese herbal prescription in action in response to the virus that we cannot name. And she's going to talk about the presentations and not to treat the disease, but how to treat the presentation, how it manifests in the body. So using Chinese principles, not going after a certain disease. That looks excellent. And then I'm going to talk on Friday on tips on how to survive and thrive to prepare yourself during this, during these uncertain times. And I'm going to go from a yin-yang aspect. I'm going to talk about the being part of you, the human being, as well as the human doing what you can do. However, your doing comes from your being. It's going to be a lot on the consciousness side of it, and then all the practical tips that you can do to thrive during this. Conscious Tuesdays, as I mentioned, we have these every Tuesday. We had Randine Lewis, we had Keith Bell, and next up is Yvonne Farrell, and then we have Laurie Deschar, and as I mentioned, we have several more people who are going to be putting on lectures on Conscious Tuesday. It's all about finding that calm in these uncertain times. And then Throwback Thursday, where you are today, we got Al Stone, the late Al Stone today on pulse diagnosis made ridiculously simple. And then we're looking for, if you have suggestions that you know from our old site, let us know. We're picking them out as well. And we'll have the late Ray Rubio do one for April 16th. And then we have a list of upcoming live webinars. So if you're looking for more comprehensive work, you're looking for continuing education credits, points, you can do this from our site. All the on-demand courses, the on-demand recorded courses are on sale for 25% off during this time of isolation. So until the isolation has been, majority has been removed, we're going to just keep this coupon active. So it's probably going to be active at least until the end of April and maybe longer, unfortunately, because if we're still in isolation. And again, that coupon code is healthy25, and you can find that at the bottom of the resource page as well. All right, so I mentioned at the when people are just coming in, if you want to comment or have questions, raise your hand. You know, it's the late Al Stone, so really it's about commenting and having discussion amongst each other. The idea was we get together, watch a lecture together, and then we get to discuss it after. And so what I'm going to do in a moment, not quite yet, but we're going to unmute you guys so you can just kind of connect and say hi, and it's going to be chaos. We do this at the end as well, but it's just this opportunity to connect. And oftentimes as you're listening, the system will pick up, and sometimes people's faces will just flash for a moment on the screen, which is really cool. And if you listen carefully, you'll start to notice voices that you recognize, that you know of people. And again, this is me wanting to create community, and it's just nice that we can kind of just say hi to each other, even though it's chaotic. I kind of want to do it. We'll do that for like 30 seconds, and then we'll start the video. I guess we'll do that, and then I'll introduce the video. So Sandro, unmute everybody. Everybody say hi.
Webinar online.
Okay, I'll mute everybody.
Dennis, Bert.
Good to be here.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Everybody.
Hi.
This is for acupuncture.
Hello.
Hello, acupuncturist.
Hi.
Hello.
Everyone.
My name is Sophie.
Everyone.
All right, thanks, Sandro.
From Montreal.
So after this, oh, am I still muted? you're muted by host. You can hear me, right? Good. After this is after Al has done his lecture, then with decorum, you'll raise your hand, which you can do at the bottom of the screen. There's a raise your hand. And if you want to add something, we'll unmute you. So it won't be like that we can actually hear you and you can share some of your pearls. So this is by the late Al Stone. And for those that don't know Al Stone, he was one of the key people for bringing Chinese medicine online. He created the website acupuncture.com. Now Yosan, I think, bought it or owns it. But he was one of the first people to bring acupuncture to the web. And that's where most people, when I started practice in 2000, this is where we all went for information. In the late 90s, early 2000s, you would Google, and anything to do with Chinese medicine or acupuncture, it was acupuncture.com, and that was Al Stone's baby. That's what he created. And one of his stories, blogs that he wrote early on really helped me in practice. So I'm just thinking about his contributions now. I remember his analogy for spleen qi deficiency. And he said, think of your body, because he did a lot of digestive stuff, irritable bowel and digestive issues. And I use this with patients so they get it. When I would say your spleen system is insufficient or weak or deficient, it's like you have a car. And if the engine is the spleen, if the engine's working really well, then you have power and you have clean exhaust. But if the engine isn't working very well, you may not have good power and you get dirty exhaust. And that exhaust we call dampness in Chinese medicine. And so, because I was trying to explain to a patient that she has spleen qi and accumulation of damp. And she got that. So what I want to do is kind of work on your engine so it's more efficient, so you have more energy and you have less exhaust in your body, which isn't good for you. And she was like, yeah, I'd love you to be my mechanic and tune me up. And I just remember I got that from Al Stone, so I wanted to put that out there. Sandra, if you could bring up the video just before as we get ready to start. So again, I'm reminding you that this is available on the Throwback Thursday for 48 hours. This was filmed a long time ago. So when you see the person introducing him, it is me, but it's from a long time ago. And remember, this is so long ago, maybe 2012. I can't remember how long ago this is. I don't know how far back it goes. But the video and audio technology wasn't as good as well back then. So just remember what we're working with. So Sandro, if you're ready, we'll get this started. And then guys, feel free to chat during this talk. And then at the end, raise hands if you have any comments. Thank you. Al, why don't you give everybody a little bit of a background, and then let's find out how we can make pulse diagnosis ridiculously simple.
Very good. Thank you, Lauren. I started acupuncture.com in 1995, and that set me up in sort of a sideline of editing Chinese information and making it more understandable for English-speaking audiences. So I've been doing quite a bit of that, editing different books for different publishing companies. And I hooked up with one of my teachers, Dr. Yi Chao, and this is the second of two books that we've done that have the study guide name. And this one was just made one of the recommended books for the NCCAOM exams, all three, the acupuncture, the oriental medicine, and the herbal medicine. So it's a great opportunity, a great book to review and even learn a lot of really essential Chinese medicine diagnostic techniques. And one thing that makes our books unique is that we focus on mechanisms, and we like to use a lot of graphs and charts because I myself am a kind of a visual learner. I like to see graphs, and I can remember things that way. And so what I've done with this 1 hour webinar is taken some of our diagrams and charts and put them into an easily digestible 60-minute or give or take around their seminar. So I hope you enjoy it, and let's get started here. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about what the problem is in understanding pulse diagnosis, at least the problem that I'm in a position to help fix. And one is that a lot of the names of pulses are very evocative and even visual, choppy, for instance. But it doesn't really translate very well into sensations in your fingertips. And unless you have a very good teacher who is in a position to show you a choppy pulse and kind of point out what things are, how it feels, it's really hard to get a sense of what choppy means. In particular, I take the example of the Rumai. this guy right here, that character. And you see on the left side there, we have three little lines that denote water. There's something about water that this image is saying. The top part is a leaky roof, and the bottom part is a beard. And so the idea of soggy comes to mind. The roof is leaking water onto a beard. I have yet to feel a pulse that feels exactly like a soggy beard, and owning a beard and feeling it when it's wet really doesn't apply to the pulse. So that's why some of the better translations, at least for the pulse names, I believe, are what they call the functional translations down here on the bottom. For instance, different scholars, different writers and editors have different needs when they're translating pulse names. Sometimes they want to stick with the kind of the sense of the character. Others want to take what the character sort of means in modern day life, such as translating the rumai into soft, a soft pulse. But for my money, the best ones are the so-called functional translations, which Maciocia uses for the rumai, and he calls it the weak floating pulse. So you know it's weak and it's floating. Yeah, forget about soggy, soft. What is this pulse supposed to feel like, a wet sponge? It doesn't make any sense. But if you know what weak feels like, it's the opposite of forceful, and you know what floating feels like, it goes away when you push hard, you got it made. All right? So that's why I'm going to be focusing on the different qualities that different pulses have. I'm not going to be talking about what sogginess means or what softness means, but what weak and floating means. The most important thing you can do with pulse diagnosis is start breaking things up into simple pairs. Now, these first six, there's three more on the next slide. These first six are really quantifiable. It doesn't take a lot of practice to really understand the difference between thin and wide, superficial or floating, and deep or sunken, depending on the terms that you choose. Strength, forceful and forceless. Does it really push through, or is it kind of weak as it passes by? Is the rate fast or slow? A simple clock can tell you that. The length, is it, let's see how I can do this. Is it traveling way up the arm, or is it kind of so short that you can only get it in the middle position? So length is kind of quantifiable too. A lot of these things are somewhat definable in terms of centimeters. They're that quantifiable, that easy to assess. And then rhythm is just a matter of, do you have skipped beats or added beats or not? Is it rhythmic or arrhythmic? So these alone can get you a lot of work done. And we're going to talk about the difference between long and short and what that implies. So just remember, what I'm trying to do is give you an opportunity to look at pulses that are complex in very simple terms. The next three are a question of tension, which I break up into taut and slack. When I'm talking about taut, I'm talking about what a lot of us call the wiry pulse. And I really wanted to use the word hard and soft here. To me, the wiry pulse is, if nothing else, hard. But the opposite of hard is soft. And the rumai is translated by some books as soft. And Dr. Chow and I thought that would be confusing ultimately. So we talk about tension in terms of taut, pulled tight and hard, and slack, where it's like a balloon with the air pulled out of it. In terms of the slippery, choppy axis, that's really a wave form, the shape of the flow as it passes by. For instance, looks like I've got a little window to work with here. Slippery is very smooth. It comes and goes. To me, it feels like a phlegm globule in a tube. I don't find the pearl rolling around on a plate to be very helpful, but a chunk of snot passing through a tube kind of works for me. And I apologize for those of you who are trying to eat dinner and eat this, watch this. The last pair are a couple of pulse qualities that are really kind of uncommon. One is vibrating. That shows up in the tense pulse or the tight pulse. That's that external cold Shanghan Lun pulse. And then there's the stable pulse, which shows up in the Laomai, the firm or confined pulse. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But between these these first three, the first six and the second three, those are all the qualities that exist for pulses. Everything else is just a mixture of a few of them to come up with soft, soggy, and all of these other parameters and words that tend to confuse us. So let's look at these simple pulse qualities. Choppy is referred to as hesitant, abrupt, or tsu-mai. Depending on where you went to school, they use different terms for that. And when we're talking about a thin pulse, it really comes down to a lack of stuff inside the vessel. It's a deficiency of blood or a deficiency of yin. There are some cases where we will also find a deficiency of qi that gives rise to a deficiency of yin or blood. If the heart qi is not strong enough, then it can't push the blood into the vessels, and so it becomes thin. But for the most part, the primary cause is blood or yin deficiency. It's a deficiency of stuff. Whereas the wide pulse is usually due to an external pathogenic factor like heat, maybe even cold, especially when it's forceful and strong. And heat, you might recall, even from the laws of thermodynamics, tends to make things expand and move more radically. Cold, on the other hand, and this is even consistent with Chinese medical classics, tends to constrict and contract and make it smaller. Heat rather expands. So this is an expression of the expanded pulse with heat. Now that's in the forceful case. We're going to go into a little more detail later on. When we look at the depth of a pulse, what we want to see is what's in the middle there. We see that the pulse is strongest at the middle, where you're pushing kind of hard, but not real hard, and you can feel it a little bit above and a little bit below. You can feel it when you push hard, and you can feel it when you push lightly. That's what you want. But sometimes the pulse is very deep. And a lot of times in school, we just kind of default to saying, oh, that's a kidney problem. Well, perhaps. But there's another way to look at it that's really more consistent with the yin and yang theory that I think makes it easier to remember. A deep pulse is a deficiency of up. And up is associated with yin or yang. It's associated with yang. So a yang deficiency is a deep pulse. It's a deficiency of up. All right? The same thing goes with the superficial pulse. In this particular diagram, we have the more common excessive type, the forceful type, where the defensive qi, the wei qi, is mobilizing on the outside of the skin to prevent an external pathogenic factor from getting in. And on the other hand, along with the deep pulse being a lack of up, the superficial pulse can be a lack of down, a lack of yin, no roots. I'm not sure what brought up the take Viagra as an answer. I'm not sure what the question was, but hey, having a good time, I guess. All right, moving on to our next slide. I always have to look carefully at these diagrams to see what they mean. Basically, the higher that little loop, the stronger the pulse. And if there's one thing that you take away from this seminar that really helps guide your clinical practice, it's the question of forceful and forceless, strong and or weak in the pulse wave. Because that's going to tell you right there whether you've got an excessive condition or a deficient condition. And if you can simply differentiate excess and deficiency, you won't hurt people, or at least much less likely of hurting people. So for anybody who focuses on 8 principles as their approach to things, excess and deficiency can be easily assessed by simply assessing the force, the strength of the pulse. And I think that's always a good idea. If you have a really powerful pulse and you end up with a deficiency diagnosis, you should probably question that. What else we got here? Fast and slow. Now, this particular diagram, at Dr. Chow's urging, she wanted to stick with the idea of a slow pulse being 3 3 beats per breath, and a fast pulse being 5 beats per breath. I just think that's kind of a waste for us to even teach. We have watches. It's really easy to use. They work well. Let's just stick with the beats per minute. But she, she's always trying to keep things traditional and not change things too much. And I'm always trying to change things and contemporize. So between the two of us, I think we get a good balance. The point being here, anything below around 60 beats per minute is considered slow. 60 to 80 beats per minute. Some people say 60 to 90. Certainly if you have between 80 and 90 and the patient isn't nervous about acupuncture, or if they haven't run up some stairs to get there, then perhaps 80 does indicate some heat. So you're saying that 60 to 80 is on the Alberta registration exam? Oh, by breath. Well, I guess they're testing your ability to remember the information, I guess. Anyway, for my money, the slow pulse is determined by the clock, the watch, the sleep second hand. When we have anything impeding the flow of yang qi, it slows things down, and that includes the heart yang, and cold would do that. Whereas heat will add to the heart yang, and I know, whose breath. Heat would add to the heart yang and cause it to get a little quicker. I think that kind of goes without saying. That's pretty obvious. Let's see what else we got here. All right. Did I skip one by any chance? No, I didn't. So the long pulse, when you put your 3 fingers down, if you feel the pulse going on further up into the thenar eminence or into the up the arm, that's considered a long pulse. If you've got your 3 fingers down and you can only feel it in the middle position, that's a short pulse. So anything outside of the typical showing up under all 3 fingers, give or take, is considered long or short. Now, personally, I find that the long pulse is probably the least important thing to know. I find a lot of young men have long pulses with no particular pathology, and tall people clearly have longer pulses, not because they're long, but because we're accustomed to normal, regular-sized patients where you keep your 3 fingers together. But if you've got some basketball player with, hugely long arms, longer than this window, that long, then we would have to keep in consideration you've got to separate your fingers a little bit to kind of calibrate to the length of the arm. However, the short pulse, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is really, really beneficial to know. It means qi stagnation. The qi is not able to flow from the middle to the outside of the other pulse positions. And because it ends up being the liver or spleen position that feels excessive in that regard, we would have to call it either liver qi stagnation or food stagnation, something stagnated. And I will show you how to do that in a little bit. Finally, we can have one of 2 things causing missed beats. One is a pathogenic factor obstructing the flow of the heart qi, and that would include heat, cold, damp, whatever. And the other is a deficiency of yang or qi of the heart, whereby its cardiac output, its rhythm, is impeded once every so often. So I don't know if I'm making it terribly simple, ridiculously simple yet. Certainly pulse diagnosis does include a certain amount of content that has to be absorbed, and hopefully it's not the first time you're hearing these things. But I hope to simplify things once I get into the pulse descriptions a little bit more. When it comes to that wiry pulse, the taut pulse, the string-like or string-taut or bowstring or hard pulse, it really comes down to indicating a liver condition or qi stagnation. The mechanism, according to Dr. Chow, is that the qi stagnates and it collects and it presses outward on the vessel. I myself did some research on this, and it's not so much that I disagree, it's just that I kind of prefer a different explanation, which comes from one of our mutual friends, Tien De Jong at Emperor's College in Santa Monica. And I said, where does the wiry pulse come from? What's the mechanism on that? And he had a really good answer. He said, the tendons are the mother of the vessels. And what he's saying is obviously liver is the mother of, wood is the mother of fire. And because the tendons are a reflection of the state of the wood element, and the vessels are a reflection, connected to the heart and the fire element, if the wood element is dry and non-elastic, then the vessels will also become dry, non-elastic, and feel to the fingertips hard. In fact, that's why a lot of Bai Shao, a blood tonic for the liver, shows up in qi stagnation formulas, because it moistens the liver, which moistens the tendons, which moistens the vessels. Cool, huh? Now, in terms of the opposite of taut, we just use the word slack. There is no particular slack pulse. If we were going to call that anything, it would be weak or forceless. All right. Next up, we take a look at some of the pulse waves. A lot of pulses are pathological in regard to how they rise and drop. For instance, if we go to the left hand over here, this is that surging or flooding pulse that we find in the Yangming Jingbing, Yangming, the Shanghan Lun, the Yangming channel disease, or the qi level heat of Wenbing, or if you want to call this lung and stomach heat in Zhang Fu syndromes, that's fine too. This is a situation where the pulse rises very strong, but then goes away kind of weak. So it feels like a wave that comes and crashes and then just sort of descends. Coming down a little further to the wiry or taut pulse, I keep using the word hardness, and I think that's a very good description for this pulse, especially if you're not really clear on what the wiry pulse feels like. However, it has another quality, and I would compare it to the slippery pulse. The slippery pulse comes and goes very smooth. Let me see if I can center my hand here. See how it just kind of comes and goes, and there's a sense of material passing through. All right? Whereas the wiry pulse, it all comes up together and then goes down together. So doink, 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 doink. Now, in the old days of the Moog synthesizer, we used to talk about a sine wave, which is kind of a rounded waveform, and then there was the square wave, which looks like that. And that really is, to my assessment, the difference between slippery and wiry. All right. So this is hard and kind of all three positions go up and down at the same time, whereas the slippery just flows through. And I lost my monitor. There we are. The choppy pulse is kind of difficult to describe as well. I'll do that with my arm if you're visually inclined. To me, the wiry pulse feels like this. It's chunky, jagged, all right? Not smooth. And we've got some other diagrams to express that as well. So those are the different pulse wave differences. Now what we get into is all of those pulses that we learn and that are on everybody's test. And what I would like you to pay attention to is the different colored text, because what I intend on doing with the color in these slides is connect the dots, basically. So a little while ago I said superficial means a deficiency of down, because it's rising up, a deficiency of yin, or else it's the defensive yang mobilizing at the external. And that's basically it. I have really not found that often superficial pulses in the case of people who come in with the common cold. It's just not my experience. However, a superficial pulse on someone who has a deficiency of yin, really common, very common. And so just remember, if it's all and by superficial, I'm referring to when you touch lightly, you feel it there, and as you press harder, it goes away. You feel it lightly, and as you press harder, it goes away. So that means that the main energy of the pulse is located most superficially. Is choppy always slow? No, I don't think so. In fact, when we get there, I'll talk about the 3-5 pulse, which is kind of fast, slow. And the slippery, wiry pulse is one that has components of both. You know, I talk about the sine wave and the square wave, but there's also the wave that's rounded on the edges, but still kind of square, or else it could be slippery in that the waveforms doesn't seem to have an up or a down. It's just, you can't really feel the edges of it with the slippery pulse, but it could be very, very hard, in which case you might call that slippery and wiry, or as I like to say, slary. Does anybody know what organ you treat when you find the slary pulse? I'll let you think about that for a moment. And I'll go to the next slide while I'm waiting for someone to say the spliver. The answer to the slimy pulse is you treat the spliver. But in reality, we know floating is the same as superficial. It's just that we just have so many different books that call these names so many different things that you'll see in the slides. I have the word that Eastland Press liked, and then that's submerged. And then the words that say Machiocha or Cam likes, and that's deep. And this is what Cam is. I call it Cam, Chinese acupuncture and moxibustion. Yeah, liver spleen disharmony, but a lot of times if it's kind of low grade, it's sort of normal too. You want to have a little bit of hardness in your pulse because that kind of implies there's some guts to it. And slippery, you should have some flow to it, but you should also feel the corners somewhat too. So when is a slippery, wiry pulse pathological? Well, one way to describe that is when there are symptoms associated with that. So, whatever that might be, from stress-induced food stagnation to IBS, running to the bathroom, whatever. And you are right in saying phlegm, especially when it's associated with qi stagnation, like Ban-Cha Ho Po Tong, the Pinellia and Magnolia combination for that plum pit syndrome. That's qi stagnation plus phlegm. So that might show up with a slimy pulse too, quite possible. The deep pulse, as I mentioned, is a deficiency of up. However, that is most evident when we also see the pulse is forceless. If the pulse is forceful, chances are you've got something in there holding the yang down. And in fact, we talk about excessive pathogenic factors. I favor cold as the likely culprit for that. Cold, I think, is the best pathogenic factor for holding down yang, because it's kind of the arch nemesis. Yang is up and warm and active, and cold is down, inactive, and the opposite of warm. What about the depth of strength indicating it has root? Well, this particular condition has root in that, but unfortunately that's all it has. If you have a pulse that has no middle or upper, then there's a deficiency of yang from lifting, but the root is apparently okay. All right. Where we tend to lose root is in that superficial pulse with the indeficiency pulse from the last slide. This pulse lacks root. This one has root. All righty. Now here's where things get ridiculously simple. Here we have a whole new pulse that you're expected to learn and know inside and out. But the fact is, it's really no different than the deep pulse. It's just a little more so. And in fact, the indications are identical. You have a pathogenic factor obstructing the yang qi from rising in the case of a forceful pulse, or a really extreme yang deficiency, which gives rise to syncope or fainting spells. And that's because the yang is unable to rise and lift blood up to the head, and people go down easily. So the difference between the deep pulse and the hidden pulse ain't much. There. We've just simplified things ridiculously. And as it turns out, the deep pulse, the confined pulse, is really the same as that deep pulse or the hidden pulse, but it's the forceful type. We have this situation where there is a pathogenic factor, likely cold, that's confining the pulse from rising up. And so we have a deep pulse, but it is forceful. Let me get that green arrow in there right there. Now, one thing that is unique about this pulse is the word stable. And this comes from the fact that the pulse never really goes down to the 0 point because it's truly full. Usually a pulse will start here, rise up and come down, but it's not like the vessel's empty like down here. Let me see if this is a pulse and it comes down, that means it's empty, and this means it's full. And what a pulse normally feels like is like this. It's always got something in it, and then it rises when the heart is pushing, but it always has something there. But what's going on with the confined pulse is it's not being allowed to rise. And so it moves around a little bit, but it pretty much stays right there. So it's the rising aspect of this firm pulse that's being compromised by the pathogenic factor, probably cold. So here's another example of a very, very simple pulse or a complex pulse that can be explained very simply. And it's no different than the weak pulse that's very forceful. Slow pulse. Slow slows things down. Cold slows things down. It causes constriction and contraction. But so we all know that cold is associated with slow pulse. But how do you know if it's excess cold or deficiency cold? Again, we return to that question of, is it forceful or is it forceless? If the case is, in the case of forceless, that means deficiency cold, or even Qi deficiency. Whereas if it's forceful, chances are we have an excess condition of cold accumulation. This is really not too much different. You like the hand dancing? I was thinking about kind of going like that too. My mother told me being a DJ in clubs back in the 80s would provide no transferable skills, but little did she know that I'd have to talk about the slippery pulse someday. All right. The rapid pulse, as we know, the heat accelerates movement. It's kind of the opposite of cold, especially if it's forceful. Obviously, it indicates excessive heat. There is a heat condition. If it's forceless or thin, then you want to look at your yin deficiencies. Remember, the thin pulse is a lack of yin or blood. And the blood deficiency can be hollow, which is palpable superficially, missing in the middle, and then palpable deep again. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is just the heat moving the pulse quicker. The heart is a fire element. It's really sensitive to heat. It doesn't take much heat to get it going. And so heat, in terms of the pulse rate, is really easy to assess. The racing pulse, again, you don't have to think about this as any different than the fast pulse. The only difference is it's faster. If it's really getting up over 140 beats per minute, I would consider talking about having the patient go to an ER or an emergency room or a physician. I would be a little concerned with that, unless they just ran in off the street or had a good reason. So, but that's a personal decision depending on your sense of confidence. How wide is the blood vessel in relation to Thun and Sun? I don't know. One thing I can say is thin people tend to have a thinner pulse, and wide people have wider pulses, and I guess that is still in relation to Chun. But yeah, I really don't know. Haven't asked that question. Vertical and horizontal force. So you're talking about horizontal force pushing this way and vertical force pushing upward. I believe that's what you're saying. I'll let you answer that question. Yeah. I'll get to that in a little bit when we have a forceful pulse. Actually, I guess we could do it now. The quick answer is I really don't know. I think they both feel forceful. To me, it's not about how high the pulse goes. It's about how much it pushes, And overall, I don't know, it's just, I hear what you're saying, and I've even asked Will Morris that question. I didn't get an answer that really stuck with me. But either way, forceful, whether it's pushing up or forward, is forceful. And generally, you're not going to find a pulse that's forceful forward and not forceful up, unless it's one of those. A good example would be that firm, confined pulse, where it can't get past a certain amount. That would be forceful, but the cold is preventing it from being up. All right? Excess heat is forceful, deficiency heat is forceless or thin. When it's rapid to this point where it's over 140 beats per minute, we're looking at yin exhaustion or collapse. Those are real close to the end of the line. And this might be something you find more often in a hospice or an ER or even a hospital. I felt rapid pulses, and they were closer to the end than they were the beginning, that's for sure. Now, we have a few pulses that we can find in terms of rate. I can see that I'm almost 36 minutes into it, and I'm going to start picking up the pace here. I apologize for that. But in terms of speeds that go up and slow down, that's going to come up in the choppy pulse for the person who's asking. The moderate pulse I describe as the groovy pulse. It's really the pulse that, might say a little dampness, but in very many cases it means normal. I call it groovy because it's boom, 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 boom. I don't know if that helps or not, but the excess pulse, these are all parameters of excessiveness. It's wide, it's forceful. Let me get over to the forceful area. And yeah, Ray, it's actually if you really want to know, it's the intro to the Temptations' My Girl. That is the groovy pulse. That's what I think of. But in each case, the excessive pulse is going to be longer, wider, more forceful, and it's an excellent means by which you can assess excess and deficiency. You want to be very clear on that at all times. The moderate pulse is called Hua-mai, and I don't know the HUA. Is that right? Yeah, I believe so. Someone can look that up while I'm working here. I'm not sure, but I believe it's Hua-mai. The deficiency pulse also can be wide, but the difference is the excess pulse wide is like a filled up balloon. The deficiency pulse wide is going to be very slack, like a balloon where all of the air has gone out of it, but it still retains its largeness. It's just like... So Hua and lax and moderate, they're all barking up the same tree. That is, we're all talking about the same thing. But I don't know what the character is. Hua, 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 Hua. Those are 4 different words. In each case, when we have a weak pulse, if it's floating in additions, we can have a chi deficiency. When chi deficiency causes a floating pulse, that's getting close to collapse. That's part of that yang collapse thing that you don't want to see. If it's deep, it could be the kidney yang, unable to rise. Remember, yang means up. The choppy pulse that is also weak could be a blood stagnation due to blood deficiency. And then the yin deficiency can be a rapid, but it can also be a weak and narrow. So those are just large ideas in terms of excessive deficiency, but still very important. And it really comes down to strength and force. The large pulse, if it is forceful, indicates heat. Heat causes the vessel to expand. If it's forceless, it's a chi deficiency because the chi, the spleen chi, maintains keeps the blood in the vessel, but it's also in charge of some structural integrity. And so when that chi gets weak, the vessel gets weak, and so it can be loose but wide, kind of large and really, really weak. Juan, thank you. Juan is lax. Yeah, I thought Juan might be slippery. You're right. And let's see, the thin pulse, like I mentioned earlier, inner blood deficiency, it's a deficiency of stuff. If you've got no stuff in your pulse, it's going to be thin. On occasion, you can look at that as secondary to a qi deficiency of the heart. If the qi deficient heart can't push the blood, it won't fill the vessel. Now, there's a third thing that I like to look out for, and the chill pulse, that works too. Dampness, if you have someone that's kind of overweight, you might find that their pulse is thin or seriously deep. But it's not so much that they have these yang deficiencies or even a qi deficiency or inner blood deficiency necessarily. It could mean that there's just a lot of adipose tissue in their wrist. Sometimes that phlegm damp accumulation shows up here and you've got to press through it to get to the pulse. And that's what can cause some problems in assessing the pulse of someone who's overweight. So the question arises, how do you know if a thin pulse is due to deficiency or if it's due to an accumulation of dampness? And my answer is don't ignore the obvious. All right? I'm listening for laughter there. That's like, high planet. There we go. Thank you, Shelley. The long pulse is, I think, the least beneficial pulse quality there is. It really doesn't tell me a whole lot. So many people have long pulses, even without having interior heat, that I don't take it too seriously. If, however, they have a long pulse plus red eyes, plus a red face, plus a fever, plus irritability, restlessness, and yellow explosive diarrhea, then yeah, it's heat. But you want to check out the other signs and symptoms, the other ways of assessing people as well. The short pulse, very important. We're going to talk about this in length because I think it really applies to the American public very well. This diagram kind of implies that you feel it in your middle position and you don't feel anything on the first or third positions. But in reality, what I find is you feel something is just excessive in the middle position. So if that middle position is excessive, that middle, the guan position, and forceful, that suggests qi stagnation. If it's forceless, then the qi deficiency is causing the blood not to fill the vessel to all three positions. But more often than not, it's forceful, or at least much more forceful than the other two positions. And this diagram comes from our book. This next diagram is my assessment of it. And it feels just like this. When you put your fingers down, the middle position is larger. I'm trying to give you some contrast to my fingers. There you go. It feels like the middle position is larger, and then the other two you can feel, but they're thin and weak. And this is an excellent indication for all of those formulas that begin with the word chaihu or bupleurum. This is a qi stagnation pulse. There is one guy who teaches Shanghan Lun in China named Huang. He likes to come up with herb pulses like the Guizi pulse or the Guizi type, the Huang Qi type, and different kinds of pulses associated with Shanghan Lun body types. I would want to add my own. That's the Chaihu pulse, the Chaihu type, and it's right there. That's a qi stagnation pulse. And Andrea, I get it all the time as well. In fact, I've got it on my left side right now. But you can also get it on the right side. And gotcha. Now, I've talked to Michael Max about this too, and apparently Huang doesn't have a Chaihu pulse specifically beyond wiry, if I remember our conversation. But this to me really just speaks out to a Chaihu requirement. When you see that, go with Chaihu. If it's on the right side, you might have all that excess in the middle position, which is associated with the spleen, stomach, the earth element organs. And if it's not wiry, consider a stagnation due to dampness if it's more slippery. Or if it's some other quality showing up in all the other indications, consider what else might be excessive in there causing stagnation. Right, yeah, wiry is the pulse of the Xiaoyang syndrome. But I don't know, Michael, if you want to bring this up to him, I'd be interested in his opinion because it It's really common, at least in my patient population, and I think it's not that different for others in North America. And one other thing that I would add in this regard is if you get that excessive pulse in the middle on the left side and it's wiry, that says chi stagnation, that's wood energy in that liver position. If, however, you get a really slippery pulse in that liver position, though, even though it's excessive, you might have dampness in the liver or damp heat in the liver. And you might want to use some of those Jin Jin, Jin Qian Sao, those Jin herbs that dry damp heat in the liver. And then by the same token, if you see on the right side this condition where the excess is in the spleen and it's wiry in nature, consider liver attacking spleen or wood overacting on earth. All right. And then another interesting pulse that is often difficult to express until you've felt it is the so-called moving pulse, the spinning beam pulse. One way in which they describe it is no head, no tail. It's kind of an exasperation of that short pulse that I just showed you. And let me show you what my diagram feels like. It's very similar to the short pulse. The only difference is there's a sense of occlusion right there. So you kind of lose it. It comes back in the upper position, the upper jaw position first, some distal, however you call it. And it's very excessive in the middle. But there's like a little occlusion here, as if something's pinching it, where you can't feel it. And so that's my take on this particular diagram. And what does that say? But the chi stagnation in the middle is so great that it's unable to nourish the upper. And it kind of works out really well in five-element theory too. This could be, if it's on the right side, it could indicate spleen or the earth not nourishing the metal. If it's on the left side, it could indicate the liver's blood not nourishing the heart due to stagnation in either case. Let me get Ray's question here. Experience regarding biomedical conditions that you find correlate to more to certain pulses than others. Corticosteroids, pulse becomes rapid, forceful, slippery, excess in all positions. Ray, honest to gosh, I don't see so many patients that are taking a lot of drugs, and I would have to admit that my beyond prednisone causing damp accumulation, which I see often, I don't have a good answer for you. It's just not really my area of expertise. So sorry. The slippery pulse, as I've mentioned earlier, it has no beginning and no end. It kind of comes and goes. What you want with a pulse is sort of like that cursive R, where it's up, down, down, up, down, down. You know, you want to have some edge to it, but the slippery comes and goes very slowly, not in rate, but in the rising and dropping. It's very rounded. There's no edge to it. And like I've mentioned earlier, I just don't care too much for this pearl rolling around on a plate statement. It might have worked in in China when that meant something, but for us in the 21st century, I prefer a phlegm nodule or a globule of snot in a tube. That's kind of how it feels to me. And what makes pregnancy pulses happen? I believe it has to do with the addition of more fluids. Kind of makes the pulse slippery and excessive. That's my take. That is mentioned in this book. I just don't recall what the answer is, but there is a lot of talk about pregnancy pulses. One thing that we do want to keep an eye on is in the slippery pulse, we're always looking at the earth phase. All of the slippery pulses point to earth. It doesn't have to be damp or phlegm. It can be food stagnation. It can be heat in the stomach. It can all indicate earth and tends to be. The choppy pulse. This is a little funky too. There's a lot of different ways of describing this, and I have not felt them all. But one thing we do know is it is unsmooth. It's not it's not the same every time. One time it's loud, one time it's soft, one time it's kind of slow and weak, the other time it's forceful. And that's what the top diagram there, the rough shape, kind of implies this. I don't know if you can see that because of the bit rate on the video feed there, but I'm being kind of choppy. I don't know if that works or not. Now, Bob Flaws talks about a so-called 3-5 pulse, and he describes that as a pulse that is 3 beats per breath followed by a pulse that's 5 beats per breath. And as someone asked earlier, what about the pulse that's rapid, slow in quick succession? That's the choppy pulse, or at least one indication of it. Now, it is true that during a person's inhalation, the pulse tends to be a little quicker, and during the exhalation, it tends to be a little slower. And the more emotionally sensitive a person, the more obvious that's going to be. And I don't consider that to be necessarily an indication of pathology. You have to be really, really, really pay attention to watching their chest rise and drop and listen to the beat to see that happen. But it is physiological. I believe it has to do with the vagus nerve running both the lungs and the heart. It probably has something to do with that. But there is, the way I kind of discovered the choppy pulse is it looked like this. It rose normally, but on the way down it had steps. It rose normally, and on the way down it had steps. Sure enough, the tongue was purple, and she had some blood stagnation issues down yonder. But for those of you who aren't really clear on the shape, what the choppy pulse looks like, at least a low-grade pulse that I was able to find, it looks like this. This is, I think, a pretty decent look. So slippery comes and goes smoothly, but the choppy pulse goes like stair steps. Hope that helps. The flooding pulse comes strongly, goes weakly. This is that Baihu Tong pulse. This is the chi level heat, Yangming, channel disease, lung stomach heat. The 4 bigs are associated with this: big fever, big pulse, it's wide, big sweating, and big thirst. And the reason I bring up the sweating and thirst is because with the loss of sweating, you lose chi and you lose fluids. And so the pulse comes strong as is indicative of excess heat, but on the way out, it goes weak. Comes strong, goes weak. And that weakness is the slow, steady loss of chi and fluids that arises with the high fevers, sweating. So that's what the flooding pulse is all about, is it indicates a fever with damage to the body fluids. Oh, I'm glad you like it, Dee. So the wiry pulse, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard, and it all rises together. It goes up together and down together, whereas the slippery is more like this. You can feel it passing through. The wiry pulse just up, down, and it's flat on top. Now, Dr. Chow, the author of the book, she wanted a diagram that came to a point, and I just didn't get that. It just seems flat on the top to me. So the flooding pulse in Chinese is, what is that? Shi Mai? S-H-I? Maybe Michael can jump in on that. What else do I want to talk about with the wiry pulse? Oh, as I mentioned earlier, the mechanism that I like to talk about is that when the liver gets dry, the qi becomes stagnated. And when the liver is dry, thank you, Mike. When the liver is dry, the tendons become dry, which leads to dry vessels, which leads to hard vessels. So I think that's a pretty decent mechanism for the wiry pulse. So what do you do about that? Bai Xiao, and plenty of it. The tight pulse, I cannot say I've felt. Don't know the pulse, haven't felt it. So I offer you this idea that it vibrates somehow. You know, essentially what all this artwork is the same as the wiry pulse with these little whiskers on top. Now, I conceive of the tight pulse as shivering, but until I really feel it, I'm going to hold off on taking away that question mark. I really don't know. Fortunately, you don't have to guess when it's an exterior cold condition because the person's going to be sneezing and they're not going to feel well, and you're going to see a common cold or a flu going on in front of you, and chances are they're going to want their suffering alleviated more than their pulse, detightened or loosened. All right. Gotcha, Ray. The rapid irregular pulse. Rapid means heat. Irregular, if it's forceful, means that there's something getting in the way of that heart chi. It's an obstructive pathogenic factor. If it's forceless, the yang or the qi cannot generate the pulse. If there's not enough fluids, as in yin, the heart is going to have nothing to push once in a while. If the heart has no yang, it's not going to have enough energy to push once in a while. So if the rapid irregular pulse is fast, think about a yin and yang deficiency, because the yin deficiency causes the heat. The yang deficiency causes the irregularity. And lateral vibration, yeah, I'd still like to be able to feel it so I can put it in my own words, but hopefully I will someday. Excess heat, if it's forceful, heat can cause stagnation, or stagnation can cause heat. The indications for Sini-san, frigid extremities powder, was originally what's called yang jui, or heat clumped in the middle, preventing the yang qi from circulating to the extremities. And so that's an indication of heat that causes stagnation. On the other hand, we all know that qi stagnation that we might treat with Shaya-san, rambling powder, can become hot, and in which case we give Jiawei Shaya-san, modified rambling powder, which includes the 2 added herbs to clear heat from the liver and the heart. So rhythm, we're still looking at components. Heat equals fast. Irregular pauses means deficiency or stagnation. The same thing applies to the slow. In this case, it's cold plus a potential deficiency of heart chi. This one's a little funky. This one isn't quite so simple. There's an assumption that a heart chi deficiency allows pathogenic factors to get in there, and that's a little bit more esoteric, but that's what the book indicates. Speak about the very common push-down liver pulse that I see all the time in women working women. Push-down liver pulse, not familiar with that. Is it deep? Hard? The consistently irregular pulse, again, if it's forceful or rapid, we're looking at something that's getting in the way of something extra that's getting in the way of the steady pulse. And if it's forceless, there's a deficiency of heart chi or something like blood that's preventing the pulse from continuing on regularly. Deep, yes, the gallbladder pulse is not there at all, or just deep with 3 levels. So you see that with working women? Is that the deal? I'm not familiar with that pulse, although there are a few normal pulses. Okay, there is a normal pulse called the 6 yin pulse, where it is deficient, it's deep, it's thin, it's weak, and the person shows no indication of pathology. In other words, it's just sort of a constitutional normalcy for this person. And the same thing happens with excess pulses. I've got 2 minutes left. I got to really run here. The weak pulse, or the soggy pulse, is again made up of 3 components. It's superficial, it's thin, and it's forceless. Forceless means qi deficiency. Thin means yin or blood deficiency. Superficial means yin or blood deficiency. And all this soggy pulse really wants to say is deficiency of qi, blood, and yin. It makes sense when you look at the components. The same thing with the next 2 pulses, both of which are deficient. The weak pulse is exactly the same thing, only it's a little deeper. And the frail pulse is even deeper than that. They all say the same thing, a deficiency of yin or yang or qi and blood. Probably more than one. See you, Ray. Hi, Tatiana. And the lever pulse and the next one, the hollow pulse, are both situations whereby there is a sudden loss of blood. And so we lose the inside, we lose the guts. However, the chi has not yet been impeded. The chi is still there, and so the external ends, the superficial and the deep, remain rather strong. In time, they will get loose, or maybe the pulse will become wide and soft as well. But at first, when that happens, that's what we're looking at. And I realize we don't see that. Very important, a lot of times people's pulses are not located where you expect it in the radial artery. I had one guy, strong 24-year-old man, had some problems, took his pulse really weak and thin and deep, treated him for deficiency, and then later on I found a really strong vessel over here next to large intestine 5, up on the large intestine channel, and it occurred to me I wasn't taking the guy's radial artery anymore. I was checking some deep radial vein or something, whereas the radial artery just accidentally, God created him a little funny and it ended up over here. In which case you really can't assess depth, but you can certainly get a sense of, a lot of these other components. So watch out for pulses that aren't where you expect them to be. And finally, this is a pulse that I'd like to talk about briefly. It's lacking root in the lower jaw position, and it's deep in the upper jaw position. That's kind of reversed. That's a yin deficient pulse. What you want is deep in the lower jaw, and if it's going to be superficial anywhere, make it in the upper jaw. But I didn't have much time to get into that very much. But thank you for making this a ridiculously wonderful seminar. I'm happy to keep going for a little while if you want, Lauren. But
thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Good night, everybody.
That brings back a lot of memories. It's just neat. Some friends on there that are talking to him, Michael Max. He's saying hi to Ray, the late Ray Rubio, who we'll have on April 16th. Tatiana is on here now, and Ray was Tatiana's husband, and you obviously Tatiana knew Al really well. So I'm sure mixed emotions for people that knew Al really well, and then also hopefully some warm feelings come up because you got a chance to connect with his spirit again and just remember how awesome he was, right? His humor and his teaching style. So we're going to have you raise your hands if you have anything you want to share or comments you want to ask. So this is a great time. We're going to turn all our mics on for a second. So still raise your hand if you have a question. But if you have anything you want, this is your chance to actually send your love to Al, thank you, Al, send that out to his spirit if you want to just say hi to Al and to each other that you see on the screen. So let's do that for about 30 seconds. And then if there's any questions, we will take those questions. I think a poll is going to come up, by the way. So we have Ray Rubio for April 16th, but on Thursday, which is April 9th, we're putting up a poll of what we're going to do. We have a couple ideas, so I think we're going to give you guys a chance to vote on it. I know for many, it's Passover, and so we wanted to be conscious of that as well. And I know some of you won't be able to make it. You'll have 48 hours to watch the recording. And again, many of you, I think, do the first Seder, but not the second Seder. So just want to be respectful of that. I celebrate the Passover too. So for those people that celebrate it, don't think I'm picking on you. I only do the first night, and my team will be here for the Thursday, Throwback Thursday next week as well. So let's turn off the mute so everybody can talk, and let's let Al know how much we still appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Al.
Beautiful. Thanks
We're
so
all
much.
here. I was seeing
Presentation.
Thank you, Lauren.
Beware of dog.
You're doing cross.
Good. And if you have any questions, raise your hand.
I've been just taking a ton of classes online.
Hi, Tatiana.
Hi, Lauren.
Yeah, all Chinese med stuff. All Chinese med stuff.
Come up. Jesse's on.
Places that run seminars are publishing all these free seminars, so I'm learning like a ton of stuff every day, which is kind of like my head's exploding. There's so much content coming in. Oh yeah, that's been pretty good. And
so if you have questions, put up your hands. I like, when I think of Al's talk now, it reminds me of Albert Einstein's quote, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And obviously I think Al did this really well on his lecture. And tomorrow, Friday, we have Sharon Weisenbaum doing a webinar on herbal medicine, classical herbal principles for the virus that cannot be named. On Saturday, we have a 5-hour telehealth course. So if you're looking to find ways to bring this for yourself to reach your patients, another source of income, but more importantly, to reach your patients during this time of isolation. I've taken this course and it's helped us kickstart my clinic in Vancouver for telehealth. So we're very happy with it. That's why I'm sharing it with you guys. And on Sunday, I'm going to do a talk as well to help you find tips to survive and thrive during this time and coming out of this time. And then it keeps on going every day. So you just keep checking the healthyseminars.com/resources. The course on Saturday, it's 5 hours, and we will have CEUs, distant CEUs for you guys. We won't have live CEUs for that one. Is there anybody that wants to share about the pulse, or any questions, comments they have, or questions you want other peers to answer? I know for me, it was so good to listen to that again. I'm actually going to listen to that again because I got so many great tips from listening to that and thinking of certain patients that I wish I could get my hands on their pulse again. But I'll have to wait a couple weeks for that. If there's no hands, then we'll jump out. You will get emails again. So we're emailing you daily. I apologize if you're getting lots of emails. I'm hoping they're appreciative because you can look to see what's on and you have something that you can fill your day with that will fill your soul and make you feel good. And if I don't see any hands, we'll end this shortly. And again, check out healthyseminars.com/resources. On that page, predominantly free stuff. You'll also find some of the courses that have CUs that you'd pay for. And remember, all the recorded courses are on sale during the month of April. The coupon is Healthy25 for all recorded. And then we have several live webinars coming up. We couldn't do the Integrated Fertility Symposium. And so as a result of not being able to do IFS this year, we do have a few courses that were scheduled for IFS 2020 happening during that weekend. So we got Joe Prezano, a naturopathic doctor. He started Bastyr University. He's going to do a 3-hour detox course. And then we got Randine Lewis doing a talk on I think it's the Sunday, I'm not sure. And we have Jacqueline Chassie, naturopathic physician, treating functional medicine for fertility. And those are both 6-hour courses. All right, Ray is definitely going to be on the 16th. Thank you guys very much. I don't see any hands up, right guys? So we're able to cut this out. Let's release the microphones again so you can say hi to all your lovely peers and colleagues.
Hi, everybody.
Maria Elliott, I love the fact that you have a lizard while we were doing the lecture. You and your lizard. Guys.
Because I was watching a webinar. Yeah, I was watching. That's good because now they're like,
Okay.
yeah, they do.
Well,